This question comes in from Parker via email. Parker asks, what features/qualities does modern Microsoft Windows have that you wish were more prevalent in the free and open source software and Linux world? One big one I can think of, Parker continues, is backwards compatibility. So even in modern Windows, you can run a binary made decades ago. From Parker. P.S. Parker says, not an Arch user. Nicely done, Parker. It's amazing to me how many people include the P.S. I'm an Arch user. It's awesome. I mean, I know it's at this point it's a little bit of a joke, right? Because we make fun of people because vegans and Arch users, they gotta tell everybody that they're a vegan or an Arch user. But the reality is they kind of do, and then we make a joke about it, and now I get emails constantly from people, and at the end they'll be like, P.S. Arch user. And I think that some of them aren't even Arch users; they just want to be able to say it. Anyway, what features or qualities do I think I would like to get from Windows and the Linux side of things? The binary backwards compatibility is honestly a big one, but that is getting better. So how do I put this? Backwards compatibility has been historically a problem in the free software world, and it really has. If you've tried running, a decade or 15-year-old software on modern Linux distributions, most of the time it's just an absolute nightmare. We used to make fun of Windows users getting caught in DLL hell, but the reality is, in the Linux world, we have something almost identical, and we have shared libraries all over the place where if you don't have the exact right version of it, your new software just ain't going to run, which means you have to rebuild, and a lot of times you can't rebuild because you got something that's dependent on different versions, little stupid shared library. It's an absolute mess. Luckily, that situation has gotten a little bit better in recent years with things like AppImage. If you don't know what AppImage is, basically the idea behind AppImage is you take an ISO file, like a standard ISO file that you'd use to write to a CD or a DVD or a thumb drive or something, just a disk image. And inside there, you'd put the binary of your application along with a bunch of supporting scripts that will auto-launch the application when that disk image is mounted, and inside that ISO will also be as many of the required support libraries as is possible. So what you can do, for example, is you can download an app image of old school web browsers, including some of the earliest versions of like Firefox and even earlier, that you can run on modern Linux desktops. If you try to run those by themselves, they just will crash and burn. But with AppImage, you've got all those dependencies baked in, which solves a lot of that problem. It does mean you take up some more disk space. It does mean you take up some more RAM. And you guys know me, I like things light and lean, but I also like backwards compatibility. So in some cases, having the ability to sacrifice some lightness, some leanness for crazy amounts of backwards compatibility and really forwards compatibility too, it does make a certain amount of sense. I think it's beneficial. Excuse me. And I think it's gotten better. However, still is somewhat busted. And you're right. You can drop in like a nice Win32 app that ran fine under Windows 95 today. How many years later? 25 almost years later, and it most of the time, not all the time, it will run under Windows 10, and that's impressive. It is. That's actually pretty doggone impressive, and I would like to have more of that. But outside of that, really, if we take that and put it off to the side for a minute and say, well, AppImage solves some of those issues. It's a bit of work because we have to package some of the older software and prep them to be run on newer systems, but it is doable. But we say, okay, we've solved that, or at least made it better. There's no big thing I want in Windows that I don't have on Linux-based systems now. There's no feature. There's no UI thing that I think Windows does better. My UI here on my systems, crazy nicer than the current Windows user interface. Crazy nicer. And almost infinitely more configurable. It is so much more awesome. Driver support, there's nothing I have that I don't have drivers for under Linux. That doesn't mean it's always a cakewalk getting said drivers, but it's not always a cakewalk getting said drivers under Windows either. In fact, usually it's easier under Linux. Usually display drivers, sound drivers, networking drivers, usually those work under Linux now. And when they don't, yeah, you have to build a new kernel module or something like that. But usually it's a one-step process or one script you have to run, usually. And under Windows, you install Windows, and I mean, half the time, most of the hardware just doesn't even work. And you have to install new drivers to get things working. And sometimes that can be done through the Windows Update system, and sometimes you need to install off of a driver, of a downloaded driver file or whatnot. It's been a little bit since I tinkered with Windows, but it was last year I did a Windows challenge where I challenged myself to use Windows 10 to produce my show for a month, and it was painful because I didn't enjoy using Windows. It just wasn't a system I loved using. But it worked. It worked fine. But I had to load like 80 million different drivers. And under Linux, I didn't really have to load anything. I mean, I did have a NVIDIA GPU, which has closed source driver that I had to install, but that was like the one driver I had to work around on that. So that's not an issue, really. The amount of available software, even games under Linux. I mean, I have a ton of games on Linux available now. I'm talking AAA titles. Are there all of them? No. But do I need all of them? No. Anyone who grew up in the 80s or early 90s, there was no computer system that had all of the games. Not DOS, not Windows, not Amiga, not Macintosh, none of it. And we always looked at the other computer systems and said, oh, look at that system. That's cool. That has a cool game. Or a better version of the same game. The Amigas always tended to have like a more graphically impressive, more awesome version of all the DOS games. You know what I mean? So that was just a common thing. So nowadays, I don't see any issue with that. None whatsoever. Can I throw on Steam on here? Yeah, I can. Totally can. Does it run great? Yeah, it does. Does it have a ton of games available to it? Both native Linux stuff that was made for Windows but runs great under Linux via Proton and whatnot? Yeah, tons. Is so many games, so many AAA titles available constantly in a never-ending onslaught of new AAA titles that it's impossible to play them all? Yeah. So what am I needing here? I can produce this entire show. I do all my work on the go, all my writing on my web browser. There's just nothing I need. And it's not just saying I can get by. I'm saying I can get by in a better way than on Windows. I actually have better performance. I have better usability. I have better stability. I have better security. I have to deal with less viruses and virus scanners and blah, blah, blah. There's nothing I want. But the backwards compatibility of Windows is impressive. That's a lot of work that Microsoft put into that, and they should be given kudos for that because that is a lot of work, and I think it's an important thing. And it is something that we haven't been as good about on the Linux side, but that's getting better, and that's pretty cool. That's a good question. I bet there are things out there that a lot of you look at Windows and you're like, that's better under Windows. I just would disagree. I think the Linux side of things is significantly more interesting. To be fair, though, I enjoy both the stability, the feature set, and the user experience of Linux, FreeBSD, Haiku, the Amiga Research Operating System, and so many others over Windows. And that's not because it's made by Microsoft. It's just because I feel like the last several versions of Windows have kind of jumped the shark a bit. Older versions of Windows had a lot going for them. Windows NT 4 and Windows 2000 were fast, relatively stable, and had a great deal of backwards compatibility. They were really quality systems for what they were. Microsoft has lost that. They don't have that edge anymore. And just from a practical standpoint, even if None of these platforms were open source. If all of them were closed, I still don't think I'd choose to run Windows. If all of them were open, including Windows, I still don't think I'd choose to run Windows. It just doesn't have enough going for it to make it viable and interesting for me in 2019. And of course, if you go to Pogo Linux, you could get a server or workstation from them and put Windows on it. But why would ya? They've got Linux right in their friggin' domain name, pogolinux.com. Great servers, great workstations, just like the ones that power this show. Big friends of the open source and free software world. They've been going to Linux conferences like Linux Fest Northwest and Scale and so many others for years, and sponsoring them and giving away hardware to free software enthusiasts. These people are amazing. Go to pogolinux.com and check it out. Or you can go to these URLs. If you get bored, you're like sitting at work and you're thinking to yourself, I could use to click on a URL right now. And then here you go. Go to lunduke.com and start clicking on links. All these links are up there on lunduke.com. It's the most fantastic website ever because it is one page. It's purely static. Not only are there no trackers of any kind, there's no JavaScript of any kind. It renders great, fairly great, on really old web browsers, and it is fast as grease lightning. It loads thanks to the power of HTML tables. That's right. My website uses tables. Go to lunduke.com for all that good stuff, and then come back here. We'll do more shows.